Hello and welcome to Trading Places, Unit 4, Part 6. Now it's time for a snide remark where we bring it all together to talk about the European impact on the continent of Africa. And ultimately, we need to ask, how did European global trade affect the prosperity of Africa and the Islamic empires? Traditional trade patterns, such as the Trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean trade routes, were disrupted or destroyed by the new global trade routes dominated by the Europeans. And over time, around 15 million Africans were lost due to the Atlantic slave trade, disease, and conquest of the Europeans. The losses were devastating, but may have been offset by American crops such as cassava, which grew well in many parts of Africa. Due to the increased nutritional value of this crop, many Africans lived healthier lives. And regardless, African families were robbed of labor and talents. Polygamy, in which one man would be married to many wives, became commonplace since mostly men were lost through slavery. Some Western and Central African villages became predominantly female, so polygamy expanded. Looking at a modern ethnic map of the world, you can see that the Americas are mostly dominated by European ancestry. However, this is not the case for the other regions of the world that were controlled by Europeans. This is because of disease and geography. The Old World diseases, such as smallpox, influenza, and the plague, decimated the Amerinds, but had less effect on regions already exposed to these diseases, regions such as Africa and throughout Asia. When the Dutch and later the British settlers expanded in South Africa, they had stumbled across one of the few parts of the Southern Hemisphere that feels just like Europe. Because the Cape and Europe lie at a similar latitude, the temperature and climate of these widely separated regions are almost exactly the same. The Europeans were able to establish prosperous farms and settlements. However, at around 23.5 degrees south latitude, the Europeans passed a major geographical boundary, the Tropic of Capricorn. They had left behind their familiar European climate and entered a totally different environment. The continent of Africa was composed of thousands of different tribal groupings, and this is even true up to today. Each group is subtly distinct from the next in custom and in language. One of the main reasons for this is because Africans had adapted to their particular environment. Many civilizations had developed vaccinations against diseases like smallpox. However, their adjustment to malaria, that is transmitted by mosquitoes, required even further adaptation. Africans tended to settle in high or dry locations away from the wet, humid areas where mosquitoes breed. This is a major reason why millions of Africans need to gather water sometimes over great distances. And by living in relatively small communities spread out over vast areas, Africans limited the level of malaria transmission. Consequently, with fewer large empires and inferior weaponry, the Africans were overwhelmed by the European intrusion. However, as the Europeans moved into the tropics, their crops failed. Wheat and barley, the crops that had supported European civilization for centuries, had not evolved to survive in this tropical climate. Different from the Africans, they built settlements by the rivers and lakes they used for water, in places infested by mosquitoes, and thousands died due to malaria and other tropical diseases. Nonetheless, the Europeans would press on and eventually colonize virtually the entire continent of Africa. They organized towns and cities, structured much like their own states, with high concentrations of people in cities, as opposed to being spread out over large areas. This had the negative effect of enabling disease to spread more easily. And this reality continues to plague sub-Saharan Africa to this very day. The subjugation and control of Africans led to racism that became perpetual and hereditary. Many Europeans followed a scientific belief that they were racially superior, and that in turn, Africans were inferior, and even believed to be subhuman by many others. Europe was materially enriched through the exploitation of other people, but many were morally diminished due to their connections with the slave trade. From the 1500s to the 1700s, the Europeans globalized trade and spread their culture into Africa, the Americas, across Asia, and beyond. The shifting of trade to the Atlantic and around Africa diminished the importance of the Silk Road and the Trans-Saharan trade routes, weakening the Islamic and African empires respectively. Western Europe had become the primary carriers of oceanic commerce, the rulers of the most powerful empires, and the main centers of a global economy. And what better way to end the video than with a snide remark? The trans-Saharan trade routes were established in the 100s, connecting North Africa to Western and Sub-Saharan Africa. Europeans established trading posts in Western and Central Africa in the 1500s, increasing the movement of goods and slaves. The Atlantic triangular trade shifted commerce away from the African interior and toward the coast. Through warfare and a lack of resources, the West African empires splintered into dozens of smaller kingdoms, posing a weaker deterrent against Europe. Proximity to Brazil and the Americas led to massive depopulation of Central Africa through the Atlantic slave trade. Several African civilizations resisted European expansion, but were overwhelmed by Europe's superior weaponry and tactics. And finally, the Europeans increased their prosperity and power through their own ingenuity, but also through the subjugation of other civilizations.
Bingo.